and I'm not talking about my outfit this morning. Have you ever made a decision that shaped the future of your life? When I was in grade 9, I decided that I was going to be a pastor, that I was going to be a youth pastor just like my youth pastor. And that's not a decision I've ever regretted. That's not something that I wish I could take back. It was some of the decisions that came afterwards, because in grade 9, I decided that, okay, I'm going to be a youth pastor, and there are some things that I don't need in life, especially in high school life. And so when it came time to register for classes for grade 10, I decided that pastors don't need math, right? What pastor needs math? We have people that will do it for us. Ed Biggs, our treasurer, will do all the math that I need for him. And so I decided instead to focus on the things that I thought would matter when it came to becoming a pastor. So I focused on psychology so I could figure you all out, right? I focused on history, because from history come lots of great sermon illustrations. I focused on geography, because if we're going to talk about Jaffrey and a Jaffrey offering and missions and stuff like that, I better know where these places are. And I studied computer science because, well, that was just for me, and I liked video games. But I didn't take any calculus, I didn't take any geotrig, I didn't take any of the higher maths. But here's the problem that came out of that, is that I didn't become a pastor till I was 35 years of age. And so from 18 to 35, I did a whole bunch of other different things. When I graduated from high school and then college, I went into business. And I managed some stores. And guess what? There's math involved in that. Payroll. You know, I had to be able to do payroll and figure out all the complicated formulas that were involved with that. I went into computer science. I went into the computer industry. I went into IT, and I became a computer programmer. And guess what? There's a lot of in computers, math. After that, I went and I worked for a university. I became the director of operations, and guess what? More math was found. And then my VP said, Kirk, I want you to go and I want you to pursue an MBA. And I started to look into that, and I discovered one thing that was required there: all the maths that I didn't have. And then finally, when I became a pastor, all right, it's easy street, right? Well, I was the administrative pastor and had a $4 million budget to oversee, and there was a lot of math in that. Okay, a few years ago, became senior pastor, finally it's easy street, right? No. I wish there was no math involved. And that was a decision that I regretted long ago, but it was a decision that I made in grade 9 that I wasn't going to pursue any of those higher maths. And since then, I've regretted it because it's caused me frustration. It's caused me to have to do upgrading of my skills. It's closed some doors for me along the way. I wanted to become something, but this math and this lack of math in my life was holding me back. Have you ever made a decision that shaped your life? I think all of us at one time or another have made a decision that has shaped who we are today. Maybe you made a decision like me not to take any of the maths in high school, and you're kind of regretting that. Maybe you made a career choice and you're thinking, this is the best career that I could ever want. Maybe you made a choice to start dating somebody and you're still paying for that mistake. You regret that. Or maybe you chose to marry a certain someone, and that has been the most amazing thing that's happened in your life. All of us at one time or another have made a decision that has impacted who we are becoming and who we became today. And sometimes we regret the decisions we made, and sometimes they go amazingly well. Well, how can we make sure that we always choose the right thing? We were in this series called Becoming. And the question that we're asking throughout this series is, who are you becoming? And over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about character. And we looked at how character is the single greatest indicator of who you are becoming. And we talked about how we have to work on our character in some ways if we're going to become the person that we were born to be, the person that Jesus envisions for us to be. And today, in the time that we have together, I want to talk about the single greatest character trait that will change your life if you will embrace it. That it will help you become what Jesus envisions, the person that you were born and created to be. Because we all want that, don't we? I mean, I want to live life to the fullest, and I don't want to live with any regret. So let's dig into this, and let's take a look at who we are becoming today. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of James. It's in the New Testament. It's closer to the back than to the front. It's on page 930 if you have one of these brown Bibles. And we're going to look at this. If you've been away for a while, or if this is your first time joining us, I'm so glad that you're here today. And you know what? Let me catch you up on where we've been over the last few weeks. We've been looking in this letter that a guy by the name of James wrote to a group of people that he knows who had moved away. And James is writing to friends, to people he used to be the pastor of, and they are trying to become what Jesus envisions. They're trying to figure out, how do we live the Jesus way in our situation, in our context? And in that way, it's a lot like you and me today. We're trying to figure out, how do we live the Jesus way today in our high school, in our home, in our businesses, wherever we go? How do we live the Jesus way? And James writes to tell people. It's an immensely practical book. In fact, it's very straight talking. I mean, James just lays it right out there and says, this is what you got to do. And we've been looking at that over the last couple of weeks. And James this week picks up right where he left off last week. He says this in verse 1. He says, my dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over the others? Last week, where we left off is James says, true religion, which God desires, is to look after the widow and the orphan and to keep yourself pure. And now he says this, how can you claim to know Jesus if you're playing favorites? Playing favorites. Favoritism is when we express, give somebody a benefit because of who they are. For example, favoritism would be if, for example, it was Brad Crasweller's birthday today, and I invited you guys all to sing with me, happy birthday to Brad. I would never do that, but that would be playing favorites. It is his birthday. What are you now, 65? That's not favoritism when I do that, okay? But that's what favoritism is. It's calling somebody out and saying, here, you have something good because of your relationship with me, because of what you do, because of who you are, because of how you look, or because of the power you yield. And he says to the people that he's writing to, he's just said, look after the widows and the orphans, the least powerful, the least desirable in society. And then he says, if you're playing favorites, you don't even know Jesus. That's a strong statement to make. If you're have a favorite child, you don't know Jesus. If you have a favorite friend, if someone walks in the room and you say, oh, look, it's so-and-so, we better give him a good seat. You don't know Jesus. That's what James is saying. And he goes on and he says this, for example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothing. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you can stand over there or I'll sit on the floor, well, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? He says, for example, okay, this isn't a kind of hypothetical example that he's giving. This is something that was actually happening. That the Christians in James's day, that they were gathering like us. And someone was coming in, dressed in lovely clothing, a perfect suit. And they were saying, look, here, have that perfect seat. That's a place of honor for you. And then someone was coming in dressed kind of like me. And they were saying, you sit down here. Or better yet, you sit, in our context, way up at the very back by that stained glass window where nobody can see you. And James calls that discrimination. Favoritism is when you do something that benefits someone else because of the way they look, because of who they are, because of the power that they wield. Discrimination is when you judge someone based on how they look, who they are, or what they don't have, and you act negatively towards them. They're the same side of the coin. They're flip sides of the coin. You're either favoring someone or discriminating against them. And James writes about this situation, which would never happen today, would it? When I came out on the stage in First Voice, some of you I know were pretty excited. Kirk's wearing a suit, finally. After weeks of him wearing jeans, he's wearing a suit, finally. And then you saw me come out like this, and it's like, oh, what's he doing? Why? Is there a baptism today? Maybe there's a baptism. No. We discriminate, and we play favorites based on what people look like. I remember as a child, the church that my family was going to at the time, I remember watching this person come in, a gentleman come in. And this was a small church, under 100 people. And we knew everybody. I mean, we were related to most everybody. And I watched this person come in. They didn't look like us. They didn't smell like us. They didn't dress like us. They didn't know how to behave in a service like us. Everybody noticed. Everybody whispered. And we never saw that person come back again after that Sunday. It still goes on today, doesn't it? Maybe you've got experiences like that. Maybe you can talk later in your groups about that. It still happens. And what James writes about favoritism and discrimination is still relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. And he's got a big point to make about favoritism and discrimination. He says two things. He says, first, favoritism and faith are not compatible. And if that's not hard enough to take, the next thing he says, discrimination is equal to evil. So faith is not compatible with favoritism, and discrimination is the same as evil. And what James is pointing to here is that there is something going on deeper inside of us when we play favorites with somebody at work. There is something going on inside of us when we see someone and we think something about them. There is something deeper happening in us, and that favoritism and discrimination are symptoms of a character issue inside each of us. Do you know what character is? Character is a pattern of living. When you have good actions, positive actions, repeated over time, this leads to good character in you. When you have negative actions, repeated over time, this leads to bad character in you. And character, simply put, are the actions that you do again and again, the pattern of living that you have. And discrimination and favoritism are symptoms of a character issue in you. Think of your life like a bucket. Everybody picture a bucket. We've got one up on the screen. Jesus said that I have come that you might have life and that you might have it to the fullest. He wants to fill your bucket with life. And the walls of that bucket are our character. And the problem is when we have a character issue, when favoritism and discrimination are in our life, it's like having holes in your bucket. Have you ever tried to work with a leaky bucket? When I worked in camp ministry, we used to play a game where we'd have this big barrel and we would drill holes in the side. And then we would tell the kids, okay, the race is to fill that barrel. And there was a whole bunch of holes. And so as they started dumping water in it, the water would start leaking out. And they would have to go running back and forth from the trough to the barrel, trying to fill this barrel up before it leaks all the water out. Have you played a game like that? Sometimes life is like that, isn't it? Because we have these character issues. And they make holes in our bucket. And the life that Jesus promises us, the life that Jesus wants for us, begins to leak out all around us. And Jesus wants us to live the Spirit-empowered life. And what happens is it leaks out around us because of the character issues in our life. And the water level drops. And we can't get it back up because we have these character issues in our life. And what happens, according to James, is that the character issues in your life create a leaky bucket, and you can't know Jesus any more than that character issue in your life. Because you can't fill that bucket up above that hole that's leaking everything out. And we are leaky buckets with character issues that we need to address. Because James says faith, knowing Jesus, and favoritism are not compatible. And you will never know Jesus the way that he wants you to as long as you're playing favorites. That discrimination means that your life is built around the wrong foundation, around the wrong framework. That you're basing your decisions off of evil motives, off of sinful motives. James continues. And he says this, listen to me, dear brothers and sisters. Hasn't God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith? Aren't they the ones who will inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? James talks about being poor. And he says, isn't the poor the ones that God has chosen? And what he's doing is he's reminding the people that he's written to that they are who God has chosen. And who are they? They were poor. You know what? The early church, the first church in that first century was often made up first by the poor. And somewhere along the way, the people that James is writing to has forgotten who they were when they came to Christ. And he says, remember that you were poor. And this word poor that he talks about, we often think of this as the lack of material resources, as the lack of a home or the lack of finances. But poverty is much greater than that. And there's 4 aspects to poverty. And yes, material resources, finances, this is one aspect of poverty. The other aspects are emotional health, relational health, and spiritual health. And poverty is really about brokenness in any 4 of these areas. And the word that James uses here in this context refers not just to material poverty, but to the greater poverty that I've just explained to you of, yes, being without, but not having emotional health, relational health, or spiritual health. And James says, remember that you were poor. That there was a time when you didn't have relationship with God the Father. That there was a time when your relationships with each other was broken. When there was a time when you weren't emotionally healthy either. And yes, there was even a time when you didn't have things. Remember who you are. And remember that God has chosen the poor, those who realize that they are spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and material bankrupt. That he has chosen those people to give his inheritance to pour out his Spirit and his presence and his love into their lives. Remember who you are. And the thing is, sometimes we forget about that, don't we? You know, when I was a kid, my parents looked after foster kids. And my parents, they specialize actually in probably the hardest kids, the hardest parents, where there was deep brokenness in the family. And when I was young, before I was a teen, I loved having another brother and another sister because my brother and sister are both older than me, and so I had someone closer to my age. It was great. When I became a teen, something happened in me, and a character issue developed in me. And I stopped really enjoying having a foster brother or sister. I looked at the brokenness in these families, the alcoholism, the addiction, the abuse, both sexual and physical abuse. Domestic abuse. I looked at the adultery that was going on, and I looked down my nose at these families. Why couldn't they just get their act together? Why couldn't they just be more like our family? And what I forgot, or what I didn't know, is that my perfect family, or what I thought was so perfect, isn't that perfect. Maybe yours isn't either. And if we look back in my family, I can see that there's poverty in my family. Maybe not material poverty, but there was poverty and absence of relationship with God in some of my family, even to this day. There was relational poverty. My mom's the only one in her family that hasn't been divorced. So there was brokenness there, addictions, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, lots of ugliness in previous generations of my family. I only stand here today because my parents at some point declared bankruptcy when it came to their life. And they said, God, we are poor. And we can only make it with you. And that's the only reason why I stand here today. And it's the only reason why Britt and I stand here today is because we declared bankruptcy as well. And realized that we couldn't make it on our own. That we experienced relational bankruptcy. We experienced spiritual bankruptcy. We experienced emotional bankruptcy. And even at times, our kids will tell you, there was material bankruptcy at times. And it's only by the grace of God that I stand here today. And there's a principle in James that flows throughout this whole book, is that God draws close to those who declare bankruptcy. That when we realize that we are poor and can't make do without him, that he draws close to us. And James says, remember that you were poor. The problem is we forget this, and we think we're better than this. My wife went on a business trip, and she just left this morning. She flew away. And about 15 minutes into when she should have been flying, all of a sudden I get these texts coming into me. And she's telling me, we're turning around. We're going back to the gate. We haven't even taken off yet. Because there's a little child, a 2-year-old, that won't sit still. And the woman behind my wife started berating the parents of this 2-year-old for not keeping them under control, for not keeping them sitting there. And for the 15 minutes it took for them to turn around and get back to the gate, this woman just talked as loud as she could about what bad parents these two people were. This is an Asian family, to boot, taking their young child to China, probably to see grandparents for the first time. And this woman behind my wife said, I'm a grandmother. I have 7 kids. I have 7 grandkids. And sometimes parents just have to say no. Can you imagine sitting there? You know, I'm sure if that lady thought about it, there was probably times she had at least one kid, right? She had one of her own kid that she raised. And I'm sure there were times when her own kid was probably just as bad as that 2-year-old was this morning. And yet she's forgotten what it's like to be a young parent. And she thinks she knows better. And discrimination is really any time that we think or we believe that we know better and we do nothing to help someone else. That was me as a teenager. That was this woman on the plane this morning. Maybe that's been you at times. If you've ever said something like, why can't they just get their act together? Why can't they be more like, there but for the grace of God go I? Or there's an extra grace required person. If you've ever said things like that, that's actually discrimination. Because you are unfairly judging someone based on what you see in that moment. You don't know their story. And here's the thing, you are just as poor as I am, and you are just as poor as that other person. We are just poor in different ways. And as a church, we want to eradicate poverty. That's what we say. We don't say that just because it sounds like a good thing to do. We say that because, you know what, as a church family, we have found Jesus and the wholeness that he brings into our life in every facet. And we say we want everyone to experience this. And that's what it means to eradicate poverty. It means helping everyone discover Jesus and letting him bring wholeness to their life. And James says, remember that you were poor, because when you remember, it will change the way that you respond to the people around you. But you dishonor the poor. Isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who slander Jesus Christ, whose noble name you bear? James is saying, you want to be like the rich, and yet it's them that are doing awful things to you. It's them that are suing you and taking you to court. It's them that are slandering the name of Jesus. So remember, James said faith and favoritism, not compatible, right? He said discrimination is evil. And now he says here that it's the rich, the people that he's writing to who wanted to be like the rich, that it's the rich who slander the good name of Jesus. And when we discriminate and when we play favorites, what we do is we hurt the name of Jesus, because if we're a Christ follower, we bear his name. And when we discriminate, when we play favorites, we're actually harming the reputation of Jesus Christ. So what's the solution? Well, James talks about that in verse 8. He talks about, here's the single greatest character trait that will change your life and move you from favoritism and discrimination, from thinking you know better, to doing something that will change everything. Verse 8, he says, yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. He talks about the royal law. Royal, not in the sense that a king has handed this down, and royal, not in the sense that this is a lofty, unattainable law, but royal in the sense that this is the law that rules every other law. That this is the law, the royal law, is what governs everything. It is the framework that will shape your life and change who you are. Jesus talks about the royal law in Matthew 22. Some religious leaders came up to him and they said, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the royal law. The Jews, they had over 300 laws that they followed. And yet Jesus says, this is the one that if you will get it right, that everything else will follow. Love God, love yourself, love others. That is the royal law. And this is what will shape your life and mine. It will shape our character if we let it, is love. What does it mean to love? I mean, we use that word so flippantly, don't we? I mean, I love my wife, I love my car, I love pizza. How is that the same thing? Right? To love something means to esteem it, to value it greatly, to respect it. Neighbor. Who is your neighbor? Well, look to your left, look to your right. That's your neighbor right now in this context. When you're driving home this afternoon, at the stoplight, look at the person in the car next to you. That's your neighbor. When you get home to your house this afternoon, stand on your driveway and go 360, okay? And everywhere you see a person, in every house that you see, this is a neighbor. Then I want you to go inside and I want you to turn on your TV. And every story that you see, every person in that story, this is your neighbor. Love, respect, esteem, express their value to them of everyone you meet, and even people you don't meet. So this morning, I watched a bit of The National from last night, PVR'd it. The first story was about a protest in Quebec. All right? People not wanting people to come across the border in Quebec. We've probably all heard about that. Is that loving your neighbor? No. But guess what? If we love our neighbors, this is going to be difficult, right? And Quebec is facing all of that as you have thousands of refugees coming into this province, and now suddenly they are having to pay for it. So I understand the difficulties there, but actually love requires a different response. Puerto Rico was another story, and the disaster down there, and the war of words between two politicians. I don't know who's right, but I know that love requires a different response in all of that. And James says, let love of God, love of yourself, and love of everyone that you meet govern everything that you do. And this will begin to change who you are and shape your character in a very different way than favoritism and discrimination will do. Love shapes your character. What is shaping your character today? Is it love or is it something else? What is the defining characteristic of your life? If you don't know, ask somebody. Ask somebody, what is the thing that represents who I am? Is it love? You know, in the decades after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven, in the centuries following, you know what the church, his followers, were best known for? The quality and the quantity of their love. Jesus said in John 13 that people will know you are my followers by how much you love. And that's what happened. In the 4th century, a Roman emperor came to power. His name was Julian. And Julian, he hated Christians. He really did. Christianity was legal at that point, but he wanted to do away with it. And he wrote a letter to a friend of his complaining about Christians because he wanted things to go back to the way that the religion system had been before. And he says this, he says atheism. So Julian, it's kind of funny, Julian refers to Christians as atheists because they didn't believe in the God that he believed in. So he said Christians are atheists. Atheism has been specially advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers and through their care for the burial of the dead. It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the godless Galileans, so remember, he doesn't believe that he thinks they're atheists, that they don't believe in God at all. And he calls them Galileans because Jesus was from Galilee. So Jesus' followers, godless Galileans. The godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well, while those who belong to us look in vain for the help we should render them. He says, I wish that the rest of the Roman Empire would be like these Christians, who I hate, because they love so crazily. They love people who aren't even their own. They don't care if you follow Jesus or not. They just love people and take care of the poor, even if they never follow Jesus. This is the quality and the character of the love that James wants the people he's writing to have in their life. But here's the thing, about a decade after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven, hundreds of years before Julian writes that, there's a problem. the followers of Jesus are not doing that. That's why James writes this. He says, you know what, when you get together, you're playing favorites, you're discriminating. He has to remind them that actually loving means getting down in the dirt with the widows and the orphans and caring for them in a significant way. Why? Because they weren't doing it. And James says, love, not how much you know. Love, not your separateness from society. Love is to be the defining characteristic of what it means to be a Jesus follower. And you know, today, the church has some similar things going, doesn't it? I mean, are we more known for what we're against or for the people we are for? We are just like the people in James's day. Does love define who you are? Does love define us as a church? Are we followers of the royal law? James says in verse 9, he says, but if you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. You are guilty of breaking the law. And this is the point of verses 1 to 7 and verses 9 to 11. Is that when you play favorites, when you discriminate, doesn't matter how small or how big, that actually you are sinning. You are going against what God has planned for your life. That's what sin is. Sin is rebellion against God's way. It's saying, I know a better way. And whenever we have a thought about somebody as we pass them on Scarth Street Mall and think, why do they have to be here today? Why can't they just get a job? That's discrimination. Whenever we have a thought saying, why can't they just clean up their act? We aren't letting the royal law govern our life. And James says, love will change the whole situation. We're going to jump down to verse 12. He says this, so whatever you say or whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. He reminds them of how they've been set free from the power of sin and death in their life. That they were subject to the law of sin and death. But then Jesus entered in the equation, that Jesus' love actually sets them free. His death on the cross, his resurrection, his ascension has set them free, and they can live differently than they did before they knew Christ. And he says, which law would you rather be under? The law of love? Would you rather have love be the characteristic of your life, or would you rather have something else be the characteristic of your life? Choose love. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. But if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you. Verse 13 reminds me of a parable that Jesus told. And this week in your groups, you're going to dig into this a little bit more in the book of Matthew. In this parable, there's a person, and he owes a lot of money to the king, more than he could ever repay in this lifetime. And the king calls in the debt and demands repayment right there and then. And the man stands before the king and he says, I can't pay you. And he throws himself at the king's feet begging for forgiveness of this huge, enormous debt that is greater than he could ever hope to repay, no matter what he did in his lifetime. And the king grants forgiveness of the debt. And the man, as he's walking out the back, he sees someone who owes him a couple $100. And he throws him against the wall, his hand around his throat, and says, pay me the money that you owe. And when the man can't pay, he has him thrown into jail. And the point of the story that Jesus is telling is, don't be like that man. You have been forgiven. If you are a follower of Jesus, you have received incredible mercy, incredible forgiveness. And that should compel you to action. That should compel you to do something, to express mercy, to express love to everyone you meet. It should change something in you so that the question that comes to mind is, why can't they just get their act together? But the question that should come to mind is, what does love require of me in this situation? The love of Jesus should cause you to ask, what does love require of me? This is a question that I keep coming back to over and over again. I've used it up front here before because I think it goes to the heart. It changes our character if we'll listen to it, if we'll pay attention to it. What does love require of me in this situation? And love is always a hard choice. But it is a choice that you make over and over again. If you're married, you know that. You choose to stay married. You choose to stay in love. It's not something that just happens to you. You choose it. And what does love require of you as you meet the people every day? This question keeps coming back to me. I even have a pen that has it engraved on it. What does love require of me? So that when I'm in a meeting and I don't like what's being said, I look at this pen and I can see, what does love require of me? And I can change the response that I'm going to have. And I can change the character about who I am. And if we will pay attention to this question, and if we will live according to the royal law, it will begin to change our character so that we will begin to make decisions that we don't regret anymore. And we will start to become who Jesus envisions in every way. So how should we respond to what I've talked about today? Well, I want to give you 3 ways. Something to know, something to believe, and something to do. First is know that discrimination and favoritism are symptoms of a deeper issue. That they are symptoms of a character issue inside of you. And my question is, what is the defining characteristic of your life? Pay attention to the symptoms that are in you and see if there is something that you need to come to God with. See if there's a character issue in you, if your bucket is leaky. And don't continue living with a leaky bucket, but start to make changes in your life that develop your character and heal what is going on inside of you. Believe that love is the answer. I mean, that sounds pretty glib, doesn't it? Sounds like something the Beatles might say. But we need to believe that Christ's love is the answer, that Christ's love will compel us to change, that Christ's love will transform us, that he will renew our minds and our thoughts, that he will renew our very actions. We need to believe that actually the person that we see, that we would think, why can't they just get their act together? That the solution is not that they get their act together. The solution is that you love them more. And I don't know what that looks like. It's going to look like different for each person that you encounter. It may mean coming alongside them. It may mean expressing some care in some way. Believe that love is the answer, because as we believe it, our actions will begin to be expressed and love will come out of us. And the last thing is, ask the question, what does love require of me? And then do what love requires of you. Ask that question. When you're in a meeting this week and you don't like the response that you're getting from someone, ask the question. When you see someone walking down the street and you're thinking about crossing the street, ask the question, what does love require of me? When you're walking out here and you see me in my slovenly dressed clothes, ask the question, what does love require of me? And do what love requires of you today. What if the solution to racism, to discrimination, to the problems plaguing our city, to the division in our world, to the character issues inside you and me, what if the solution is not more time on a counselor's couch, and not another royal commission or a march on Parliament? What if the solution is actually the royal law and living out the royal law in every way? And letting Christ's love compel us and change us and shape us into who he envisioned us becoming long ago, before we were ever sitting here. Let love shape your character, and you will become what Jesus envisions. We're going to take part in communion. I want to invite the worship team up. I want to invite Peter to come up and lead us in this as well. And if you're serving, I want to invite you up to do that as well. And as they're coming, I want to pray for you and for me. Let's pray. Father, James speaks some words that are tough. He doesn't mince any words. And I just ask that you would help us to reflect on what James says and to pay attention to the symptoms that are in us. All right. To pay attention to the symptoms that are us and to change us. May we all live according to the royal law.